When Vivian Hunt moved into the decaying property on the edge of Wrenwood Hills, most of the neighborhood barely noticed. The lot had been empty for nearly 7 years, and the structure on it, a weather-beaten, sagging one-story house with an unkempt perimeter, had become part of the local scenery. Overgrown vines had nearly consumed the porch railings, and the metal gate, rusted and leaning, had long ceased to function. Residents occasionally used the lot as a shortcut for dog walking, often assuming it was abandoned or perhaps city-owned. But then came the demolition crews, the drones mapping terrain elevation, and the quiet arrival of a silver electric SUV with tinted windows and government contractor tags. Within 2 weeks, the entire property was cordoned off with construction fencing, and workers began laying the foundation for something new, something modern. Vivian had no intention of introducing herself. That wasn't her style. She had made a career of staying invisible until absolutely necessary, not out of fear, but because silence was a tool far more powerful than presence in most rooms. So, as the CEO of a mid-size but rapidly growing security tech firm, she had little interest in neighborhood brunches or getting to know the locals. The property was personal, a prototype for full environmental control, a zero-energy home built from the ground up with integrated access systems, smart routing, private security mesh networks, and a gate locking mechanism that responded to dynamic object assessment rather than identification cards or keypads. The lock on her gate didn't care who you were. It responded to movement profiles, trajectory mapping, heat signature behavior, and even subtle patterns of pressure on the ground. It had no buttons, no codes, no public-facing access. It was quiet, efficient, and above all, untouchable. That's what bothered Karen. Vivian first saw her during the 3rd week of construction, standing just across the street in a sea of other identical homes, her arms folded and her lips slightly pursed. She had the look of someone whose curiosity had fermented into contempt. Karen's front yard was immaculately trimmed, her windows always gleaming, her garbage bins aligned with military precision. And every day, at 7:12 a.m., as if on cue, Karen took her morning walk around the block, except now her route included a full stop in front of Vivian's gate. No words, just a glance at the cameras, a squint toward the motion sensors, and then she would walk on. At first, Vivian ignored her. Many people were uncomfortable around technology they didn't understand. But the silence didn't last. It was the 4th Monday after the installation of the final perimeter lockdown system when it began. Vivian was inside her home office finalizing a firmware update with her integration team in Boston, when she received a push notification. Attempted unauthorized physical interference, gate mechanism, northwest. She muted the call, opened the feed, and saw Karen standing at the gate with a metal dog leash in one hand and a puzzled expression. The dog was nowhere in sight. Karen jabbed the leash through the bars and tapped the lock housing several times. Then, as if realizing she was on camera, she gave a tight-lipped smile and walked off. Later that evening, a patrol car pulled up quietly. 2 officers got out and approached her fence without stepping onto the property. Vivian opened the door herself, arms crossed, back straight. "Ma'am," one of the officers began, polite but firm, "we received a report that a gate may be obstructing public access along the sidewalk and possibly endangering pedestrians." Vivian raised an eyebrow. "You mean my gate? The one that sits 10 inches behind the property line?" "That's the one," the other officer said, glancing toward his tablet. Caller said there were potential safety concerns. Claimed it was an unusual mechanism that could cause physical harm. Vivian didn't sigh. She was beyond sighing. Instead, she nodded once and gestured toward the gate. "It doesn't extend past the property boundary. It's fully compliant with Residential Code 72A, and it's designed to be inert when not in proximity to a kinetic profile exhibiting direct access in tension." In short, it doesn't open unless you intend to enter. The first officer blinked. Could we just verify it's not a hazard? Vivian nodded again, walked to a control panel inside the wall and triggered the safe mode routine. The gate opened smoothly, silently, and then closed again once the field detected the officers stepping back. No buzzers, no flashing lights, just precision. After a few moments and some quiet back and forth, the officers thanked her and left, offering no citation or warning. But that wasn't the end. The next morning, she received a formal letter slipped into her mailbox, unsigned with no return address, accusing her of building a paramilitary-grade gate system in a residential area and creating discomfort among long-term residents. Vivian threw it away without reading past the first paragraph. Then came the inspection request from the city's minor constructions office. Then an anonymous complaint to her business licensing board, suggesting conflict of interest regarding residential tech installation. None of it stuck, but the frequency of complaints, the relentlessness of them, suggested something coordinated. Vivian understood the pattern. Karen had decided the gate was a threat, and she was now committed to proving it, regardless of facts. It wasn't about safety. It was about control. Vivian had seen this before in corporate boardrooms, in men who didn't want their power disrupted by something they didn't design. She had learned long ago that it wasn't the act of building something new that drew opposition, but doing it without asking permission. She could have chosen to fight it head-on, but that wasn't her way. She instead went quiet, letting her legal counsel begin drafting formal notices, and she instructed her systems team to begin logging every anomaly, every unsolicited approach to the gate, every time the system was touched or tripped or even lingered. The logs didn't lie. Then, one night, while reviewing proximity data, something unexpected appeared. A signal pinging the gate's hardware layer, not from a nearby phone or watch, but from a short-range spoofer, an emulation device designed to mimic Bluetooth communication, at high frequency, typically used in industrial sabotage. Someone had attempted to brute force the gate open, and they had done it from Karen's driveway. Vivian stared at the screen for a long time. Her jaw was still, her breathing even, and this was no longer about nuisance complaints. This was a breach attempt, and as CEO of a company contracted to provide secure access solutions to federal research campuses and remote labs, she knew what this could become. It was no longer neighborly tension. It was now personal, strategic, dangerous, and she was done playing quiet. The morning after the spoofing attempt, Vivian didn't sleep in, didn't meditate, and didn't check the news like usual. Instead, she poured black coffee into a travel mug, downloaded the gate's full diagnostic logs from the prior 72 hours, and emailed them directly to her in-house counsel with a 2-sentence message. Please initiate review for possible electronic intrusion under state and federal interference statutes. I want preliminary findings by end of day. Then she changed out of her sleepwear, tied her hair into a practical knot, and walked the perimeter of her property like a contractor inspecting a build site. Every sensor node, every mounted repeater, every thermal offset reader, she touched each one herself. She made no calls to the city, didn't respond to the automated follow-ups from the Municipal Complaint Center, and ignored the fresh letters slid through her mail slot that morning, which was stamped with the phrase "Community Concern" in neat serif font. The phrase was already starting to feel like a euphemism for something more coordinated. Maybe not organized harassment, not yet, but certainly a rehearsed pattern of pressure. Vivian was not a stranger to escalation. The corporate world was built on it. Most people assumed companies rose and fell based on product performance, market timing, or strategic positioning. But the truth she had learned was more human and more disappointing. Ego, projection, and the need to crush perceived threats. And now Karen, in her pressed polo shirts and smug sidewalk glares, had taken up that same strategy, projecting hostility through bureaucracy, cloaking resentment in community language. It was an elegant weapon, and in most cases it worked. Most people bent under the weight of enough letters, enough forms, enough safety concerns filed by people who had no real interest in safety at all. But Vivian had built her company specifically to resist this kind of pressure. She had built her systems not just to survive sabotage, but to map it in detail. The logs didn't just show that someone had tried to access the gate, they identified the spoofing frequency, the modulation pattern, and the Bluetooth UUID of the attacking device, one registered 3 years ago to a first-generation smart collar for small breed dogs. The exact model Karen had clipped to her yapping spaniel every morning. That detail changed everything. Vivian's lawyer, Elliot, called her by noon. "Don't speak to her. Don't escalate directly," he warned. "Let me do this through civil channels. I'm drafting a formal cease and desist notice under Penal Code 502. Unauthorized access. There's enough here for a preliminary claim." Vivian leaned back in her desk chair, watching the real-time heat map of her front yard. "I'm not worried about the legality. I want to know what she's trying to accomplish. It's not just the gate anymore." Elliot was quiet for a moment. "People like this don't have a goal. They have a compulsion. She sees you as an intruder, and now it's a crusade. I'll handle the legal side, but you need to prepare yourself for more indirect tactics." He was right. Within 48 hours, a white city vehicle marked with planning and compliance arrived unannounced. The inspector was polite but firm, citing an anonymous concern about non-standard electric infrastructure, possibly posing a hazard to nearby properties. Vivian didn't resist. She allowed him access to the outer yard and calmly presented the certification documents, the installation permits, the sealed reports from her licensed contractors, all in perfect order. The inspector, visibly uneasy about wasting his morning, eventually admitted it was likely nothing, shook her hand, and drove off. But that afternoon, her security system flagged another anomaly. A new Bluetooth ping had appeared briefly within range of her south camera array, then vanished. A different signal this time, but logged under the same manufacturer profile. Karen had a second device. Vivian didn't report this to police yet. Instead, she updated her firmware firewall to trigger auto-blacklisting for any device exhibiting unauthorized handshake behavior more than once in a 24-hour period. She instructed her team to run cross-reference checks on MAC addresses attempting entry to their demo sites nationwide, just to rule out patterns. She called it due diligence. The truth was, she wanted to be sure Karen wasn't merely a nuisance neighbor. She wanted to know whether this woman was alone in her fixation, or part of something bigger. It was a paranoid thought. It was also the kind of thought that had kept her company leak-proof for 6 years. But Karen didn't stop. That Friday, a process server arrived with a notice. Vivian was being summoned to appear at a community mediation hearing, called under the guise of resolving neighborhood tension. The complaint, signed by Karen and 2 other residents whose names Vivian didn't recognize, alleged that her security infrastructure created an emotional barrier incompatible with community harmony, and requested that she either remove the gate or open access to the shared sidewalk frontage during daytime hours. Vivian stared at the document for a long moment. The language was soft, almost therapeutic, but the implication was clear. If she didn't comply, they were ready to escalate. She could decline to appear. It wasn't a legal summons, but doing so would confirm the narrative that she was antisocial, difficult, and unwilling to compromise. And once that narrative took hold, even the best compliance record couldn't shield her. She told Elliot to file a preliminary injunction against any structural tampering, and then, against his advice, she agreed to attend the mediation. "If I don't show up," she said, "she controls the story." The hearing was held in the back room of a local library, bland and fluorescent lit, with a fold-out table and 4 chairs. Karen sat in one, wearing a conservative cardigan and a look of studied patience. The 2 other signatories, an older man with stained khakis and a woman who looked uncomfortable just being there, nodded politely but said little. The facilitator, a volunteer from the city's civic mediation program, opened with scripted remarks about mutual understanding and community cohesion. Then Karen spoke. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She framed her argument in vague terms. A sense of isolation. Difficulty explaining to her grandchildren why the neighbor's home is locked like a fortress. Concern about aggressive technology sending the wrong message to future homeowners. She never mentioned the spoofing attempts. She never referenced the complaint letters or the unpermitted inspection pressure. She spoke like someone deeply worried about togetherness, unity, neighborly openness. Vivian waited, then responded without raising her voice. She cited building codes. She cited property lines. She even quoted from a regional security bulletin discussing the rise in suburban break-ins through underprotected entry points. She closed by stating calmly that her system did not violate any law, that it had been inspected and cleared by multiple city departments, and that the attempt to frame it as emotionally incompatible was an abuse of community process. The facilitator said nothing for a long moment. Then he glanced toward the 2 co-signers. Neither had anything to add. Karen broke the silence. "I just don't want to live next to fear." Vivian leaned slightly forward. Then perhaps stop provoking it. There were no formal conclusions. The mediation adjourned with no action taken. But the moment they stepped outside, Karen turned to Vivian and with an expression as flat as polished granite said, "You've made yourself a target, dear. Not everyone's impressed by your inventions." Vivian didn't flinch. Then let them try. She walked away without another word. That night, she doubled her perimeter logging frequency and gave her head of technical operations one clear instruction. "I want forensic-grade tracking on any signal that dares touch this gate again." 2 days after the mediation hearing, AQ's maintenance contractor arrived at Vivian's property unannounced. The man wore a vest with no insignia, a utility belt that didn't match his boots, and sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He claimed to be responding to a service request from the Community Maintenance Board to assess unapproved cabling near the sidewalk. Vivian didn't argue. She simply asked to see the work order, and when the man fumbled and mumbled something about a miscommunication, she politely suggested he wait at the curb while she contacted the board directly. He left before she could even dial. That same evening, 2 more small incidents occurred. Her lawn irrigation schedule was manually overridden via the smart system, something that should have required internal admin credentials, and a large scratch was found along the side of her parked vehicle deep enough to expose the metal. Neither incident proved anything in isolation, but Vivian recognized the pattern. She didn't bother reporting it to the local police. She updated her digital fence algorithms, changed every administrative key in her network, and contacted her internal cyber team to initiate real-time incident logging with active tracing. The logs began filling immediately. Over the next 72 hours, her sensors picked up 5 separate spoofing attempts from multiple angles of her property. Each one originated from within a 30-meter radius, well inside neighboring yards, but each used a different frequency variant, suggesting whoever was behind it had either purchased several pieces of spoofing hardware or had access to configurable emulation tools. Most homeowners had no idea such things even existed, let alone how to use them. Vivian reviewed the logs personally and sent them to Elliot with the subject line, "No longer hobby-level interference." He replied within an hour, confirming he had already scheduled a consultation with a private cybersecurity investigator to strengthen the civil case. But Vivian had begun to see something deeper than digital conflict. She noticed her trash bins were never where she left them anymore. Her exterior mailbox lid had been pried slightly upward, as if someone wanted to suggest tampering, but not quite enough to warrant a formal complaint. A local gardening service she never hired left a flyer stuck inside her fence, something no one else on the block received. Small signals, low-level pressure, a death by 1,000 cuts. And yet Vivian didn't react impulsively. She took notes. She created a file called Passive Agitation Pattern, Wrenwood. Every photo, every sound clip, every anomalous device ping went into the log. One morning, while reviewing thermal footage from the northeast corner, she paused the frame and zoomed in. A figure, partially obscured by hedge and fence post, crouched beside the outer junction box that connected her power relay to the public grid. The timestamp showed it was taken at 2:43 a.m., and the figure wore a hooded jacket. Vivian submitted the image to her private surveillance contractor with a request for facial angle extrapolation and clothing recognition. The reply came back with moderate probability match, Karen. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she filed an internal protection order request with her attorney, not with the city, but with her contractor insurance provider, citing increased risk exposure due to repeated access threats and device manipulation attempts. The move triggered an independent risk assessment, a detailed on-site survey conducted by a neutral, third-party security consultant. Vivian stood quietly on the porch while a man in his 50s with a portable scanner and drone array spent 3 hours mapping vulnerabilities and breach points. When he finished, he gave her a single-page summary with a quiet nod. "This place is better protected than half the labs I've audited," he said. "But someone really wants to get through that gate." He didn't say who. He didn't need to. The next escalation was physical. A week later, Vivian awoke to the sound of loud banging just after 5 a.m. She pulled on a sweatshirt and slippers, checked the cameras, and saw nothing but darkness. Yet the sound persisted, a rhythmic pounding like something heavy striking metal. When she stepped outside, the front gate was still locked, still intact, but a metal stake had been driven into the grass 2 feet from the base, bent backward as if someone had attempted to pry the lower lock structure loose. Nearby, tire tracks cut into the wet soil, curving sharply from the curb and back again. Someone had tried and failed to tear the lock from its anchor. This time, she did call the police. The officers were younger, cautious, and less familiar with her property. They documented the damage, took photos, and agreed it was intentional. One officer walked the perimeter and returned with a small broken tool handle, likely part of the crowbar used. When asked if she had any known disputes with neighbors, Vivian remained impassive. "There's a pattern of technical harassment," she said. "I've submitted reports privately. You'll find my documentation precise." She didn't name Karen. She didn't have to. One of the officers glanced toward the opposite house where lights were on and curtains moved slightly. He made a note in his pad and nodded. When the officers left, Vivian returned inside and contacted her head of infrastructure security. "We're going active," she said. "Load the capture protocols, short range." The response came back instantly. Initiating real-time packet monitoring. Logging all proximity queries. Results will be encrypted and shadow uploaded. The decision marked a shift. She no longer intended to simply document and defend. She intended to track, capture, and neutralize every signal that didn't belong. But Karen wasn't finished either. That afternoon, a delivery arrived, a small brown envelope marked Technical Compliance Request. Notice of Review. Inside was a printout of a proposed ordinance change for Wrenwood Hills, a new policy restricting gated control mechanisms exceeding 3 independent layers of verification. It wasn't legally binding. It wasn't even official yet. But someone had drafted it and mailed it to her directly. The suggestion was clear. Her system was being targeted as excessive, isolating, and anti-neighborly. It was bureaucracy, again, dressed as regulation, a way to make the unusual illegal. Vivian didn't speak to Karen. She didn't issue warnings. She began work instead. That evening, she met with a city infrastructure advisor off-site. Not to report harassment, but to formally offer her services as a pro bono consultant for integrating passive safety tech into upcoming residential developments. Her company had the data, the patents, and now the first-hand experience of implementation pushback. If they want a war of regulations, she told Elliot later, then I'll rewrite the book they're using. By the end of that week, her Digital Shield protocol had captured another spoofing device. This one routed through an old Android tablet linked to a local school network. The origin of access attempts was becoming more desperate, more frequent, and less careful. It was no longer just Karen's crusade. Someone else had joined in. And Vivian, calm and calculating, began preparing for their next mistake. It was early on a Thursday when Vivian received the notice that changed the shape of the conflict. Not a warning, not a complaint, not even a letter wrapped in legal tone or petty jargon. It was an official city citation, a real one issued by the Department of Infrastructure Oversight, alleging non-compliance with a rarely invoked clause regarding emergency ingress obstruction. The citation stated that her gate system may impede first responder access in time-sensitive scenarios and cited a new protocol under provisional review, which had not yet passed into law but had been recommended by a district subcommittee. Vivian didn't need to read between the lines. Someone had found a procedural backdoor, a way to convert opinion into risk, to weaponize administrative caution under the guise of public safety. The fine was small, symbolic even, but the implication was massive. It wasn't about money, it was about precedent. She forwarded the citation to Elliot without a note. He responded within 20 minutes, confirming that the citation had no binding force due to its reliance on an as-yet unstable regulatory change. But he also warned her, this was no longer just Karen. There was now a formalized interest in seeing her system undermined. Someone was testing the wires of legality, seeing where they could tug, how far they could go before the net snapped. And in that moment, Vivian recognized what she had underestimated. Not Karen's obsession or the amateur spoofers that followed, but the network beneath them. The whispers, the nudges, the quiet calls made to city offices late at night from concerned neighbors using carefully chosen language. The movement wasn't large, but it was deliberate, and it had momentum. Vivian knew that fighting procedural influence required more than evidence. It required political leverage, credibility with the right people. So she made her move. That weekend, she attended a civic technology panel hosted at a downtown university, one she had been invited to months ago, but initially declined. This time, she accepted the invitation, spoke on modern access infrastructure in residential zones, and used carefully chosen phrases. Adaptive access shouldn't be seen as exclusionary. Misunderstood technology often gets misclassified. The myth of visibility as safety. She didn't mention the gate. She didn't need to. The message reached the intended ears. A city zoning consultant, a fire marshal deputy, and a regional developer were all in the room. Conversations were had afterward, contact cards exchanged. That same night, someone dumped a bag of mulch and sharp nails at the base of her gate. Vivian didn't report it. Instead, she walked outside at midnight, took photographs, collected samples using gloves, and stored the debris in sealed bags. Then, she quietly installed a vibration sensor directly into the hinge mechanism of the lock post, one designed to detect tampering within 1 millimeter pressure thresholds. It wasn't paranoia. It was insurance. She no longer cared about identifying who had done it. She cared about capturing what would come next. And what came next surprised even her. On Monday morning, Elliot called not to discuss legal updates but to share something strange. Someone had filed a counterclaim against her business entity, not for negligence or defamation, but for emotional intimidation through environmental dominance. The claim itself had no legal standing. It was worded more like a blog post than a complaint, but it had been submitted to a city-sponsored neighborhood unity council. Elliot laughed at the absurdity but warned that these kinds of grassroots filings had power not through enforcement, but through accumulation. They created an atmosphere. They shaped perception. The more they stacked up, the easier it would be for someone in an office to take them seriously. That was the moment Vivian stopped thinking about Karen as a neighbor and began to consider her an operator. She spent that evening reviewing system logs, but not just the ones tracking signal breaches. She read pattern records, who walked by her property, at what hours, how long they lingered near the fence line, whether they paused or continued. The data was dense, mundane to most, but to her it sang like a roadmap. Over time, she identified not just one, but 3 individuals whose proximity patterns mirrored Karen's, and not randomly. Their timing coincided with known spoofing events. The same casual passerby who always paused at the mailbox across from her house at 6:55 p.m. The dog walker who lingered 2 steps longer than needed every Thursday. The man who smoked exactly 1 cigarette against the same lamppost, twice a week, staring just a second too long at her cameras. It was more than nosy neighbors. It was behavioral mapping. And someone was organizing it. Vivian drafted a report, anonymized the data, and passed it through her internal analytics team, asking them to run behavioral overlay analysis, an internal tool usually reserved for corporate threat modeling. Within 48 hours, they returned a clear result. The patterns aligned with coordinated surveillance, low-level but intentional. Vivian didn't panic. She upgraded. She brought in her company's Tier 3 systems architect and requested a full forensic deployment at her home site. Hardware shielding, aerial detection sweeps, and dynamic spoof monitoring across all known frequency bands. The techs worked quietly, professionally, and by the end of the week her property was running the same defensive shell used on classified remote installations. To any observer, it still looked like a house. But now, it saw everything. Then she waited. On the 4th night at 3:14 a.m., her system flagged a silent breach. Not physical, not even wireless. It was acoustic. A vibration pulse pattern against the west fence post, designed to trigger old mechanical locks into magnetic reset. It failed. Her gate didn't move, but the signal was clear. Someone had tried a backdoor exploit that hadn't been in use since the 1990s. She stood barefoot in her living room, holding the tablet, watching the live feedback feed. No camera caught the face, but the system caught the waveform, logged the sonic signature, and identified the device as a crude commercial knockoff of a military audio lock disruptor, available online, if you knew where to look. Vivian stared at the screen for a long moment, then turned it off. It wasn't about the gate anymore. They didn't want it open. They wanted her to know that they were willing to try. Vivian didn't sleep the night after the sonic pulse attempt. Not because of fear. She had long since stopped interpreting adrenaline as anxiety, but because her mind moved too quickly to allow stillness. The evidence was mounting, not only of harassment, but of method. These weren't random provocations. They were controlled, adaptive, evolving attempts to breach her perimeter without crossing the legal thresholds that would warrant clear police intervention. Her gate was the symbol, yes, but by now it was a placeholder. What they wanted was compliance, submission, an acknowledgement that their discomfort, however irrational, had power. She spent the early hours reviewing internal protocol documentation from her firm's risk management division. Though the company focused on security hardware, The corporate legal team had recently published a white paper on non-traditional sabotage through environmental pressure tactics. It outlined scenarios not dissimilar to what Vivian now faced: coordinated noise campaigns, minor structural interference, neighbor-led compliance strikes disguised as community feedback loops. She cross-referenced the behaviors she'd logged with known psychological manipulation patterns from a consulting report authored by a third-party urban psychologist who once assisted on a governmental resilience project. The overlap was uncomfortably high. By morning, Vivian had assembled a full dossier of the harassment timeline, device frequency logs, behavioral patterns, falsified inspection reports, and community-led narrative-building attempts. She scheduled a meeting with a former federal mediator, an older woman named Tamsin, who specialized in proxy conflicts and community retaliation cases. Vivian didn't go into the meeting looking for mediation. She went to map the opponent. Over coffee, she presented a condensed overview of events, names redacted, technology referenced only in broad terms. Tamsin listened without interrupting. When the summary was done, she leaned back and simply said, "You're dealing with someone who believes they are restoring order. To them, your presence is not just disruptive. It's offensive to the hierarchy they've built here." Vivian responded without looking up. "Karen?" Tamsin didn't blink. "Karen is the architect, but someone is financing the framing." The comment hit hard, not because of paranoia, but because it confirmed what Vivian had begun to suspect. Karen had allies, people not driven by obsession, but by opportunity. Someone saw Vivian's presence as a variable that could be leveraged or eliminated depending on outcome. And while Vivian's gait had drawn the initial ire, it was the autonomy she represented that made her a threat. The next offensive was bold. That Thursday, while working remotely with her R&D team on a firmware update for a defense contractor beta program, she received a push alert that made her pause mid-sentence. Her front gate had been manually unlocked, not broken into, not forced, but legitimately unlocked using a valid physical override key. Only 3 existed. Hers, her company's duplicate stored in a biometric vault in Boston, and a regulatory override unit provided to the city infrastructure office in case of power loss or fire access. Vivian immediately triggered full lockdown. All access systems froze. The gate resecured, and the logs began tracing. Someone had accessed the override using a cloned key ID identical to the city's emergency prototype, something that, by protocol, should never have left the department's secure storage. She called Elliot, who contacted the city directly. Within 2 hours, a deputy commissioner returned the call with a hesitant voice and a politically neutral statement. "It appears the prototype access unit was requested 2 weeks ago for field demonstration purposes and has since been misplaced." Vivian said nothing. The silence was its own accusation. That evening, she held a remote meeting with her company's executive risk board and presented the situation under its most clinical interpretation. External tampering, system breach via unauthorized public asset, and confirmation of bad faith actors within a local civic office. The board advised against escalation through law enforcement until the internal legal team could determine whether any public-facing consequences would jeopardize client trust. In short, handle it, but make it clean. No drama, no press. Vivian agreed, then immediately tripled her home surveillance budget. The following morning, Karen appeared at the property line. No announcement, no note. Just standing in her khaki pants, floral blouse, and shallow smile. Vivian stepped outside, not close, but visible. "Some of the other residents have expressed concerns again," Karen said, as if they hadn't already weaponized every possible avenue. "There's talk of a petition." Vivian didn't respond. Karen stepped closer. Not past the gate, just near enough to force proximity without contact. you're making this harder than it has to be. You don't live in a vacuum. People notice when someone builds a fortress and calls it home. Vivian's voice was calm, surgical. And people notice when their neighbors abuse administrative tools to simulate legal authority. Karen's expression didn't change. I think you'll find we're within our rights. Vivian nodded once. I think you'll find I don't yield to mob psychology. Karen left without another word. That afternoon, Vivian's power flickered 3 times in rapid succession. The logs showed nothing wrong internally, but the external voltage meter reported a short cycle loop consistent with tampering at the distribution point. She contacted the utility company. They claimed a temporary outage in the area, citing equipment fatigue, yet no other house on the block reported a disruption. Vivian requested a written statement. It arrived the next day, unsigned, full of vague assurances and empty timelines. This was no longer neighborhood conflict. This was siege. And then the crack came from within. One of Vivian's junior engineers, someone tasked with routine diagnostics on demo systems, noticed a signature mismatch in the firmware validation keys for one of the beta units used in a separate city pilot program. A unit built using her architecture, but modified slightly under a municipal contract 2 years earlier. The mismatch was tiny, just a few lines of altered handshake logic, but enough to raise suspicion. Vivian asked for a full pull of the code tree, and what she saw made her heart skip. The logic used to bypass remote failsafes was identical to the override script triggered on her own gate 2 days earlier. Someone had cloned a modified firmware from a city pilot unit and used it to reverse engineer an entry exploit on her private property. And that firmware had only existed within the hands of a single subcontractor, one Karen's husband used to own, before dissolving it during a quiet bankruptcy restructuring 18 months prior. Vivian leaned back in her chair, staring at the cascading lines of digital betrayal. This wasn't just personal. It was engineered. Someone had used her own work, her own publicly funded integration pilot, as a weapon against her. With Elliot's help, she began drafting an injunction to halt the remaining city deployment units for review. It wouldn't stop the harassment, but it would expose the method. Late that night, her sensors detected a series of soft impacts near the fence line. Small, irregular, like scattered gravel or flicked coins. She activated thermal imaging. What she saw chilled her. Dead birds, 3 of them, placed in a triangle facing her gate. No damage. No markings, just silence and arrangement. Vivian didn't photograph them. She collected the bodies with gloves, placed them in separate bags, and stored them in a cold box. Then she sat down and began drafting an affidavit of intent. Not a police complaint, but a pre-litigation statement of record. She no longer sought to prove harassment. She sought to establish groundwork for action. At 4:12 a.m., her external motion lights triggered again. Karen stood in the street, staring at the house. She didn't move. She didn't approach. She just stood, in her pressed pajamas and satin slippers, watching, until the lights went off. Then she disappeared back into the dark. The line between harassment and assault was crossed quietly, without any grand gesture or dramatic confrontation. It happened with paperwork. Just another envelope slid into Vivian's mailbox, unmarked and plain, nestled between junk ads and a grocery flyer. Inside was a single page, a formal citation alleging her system had interfered with an emergency signal transmission. The wording was technical, heavy with legalese, and cited a non-existent regulation. What caught her attention wasn't the accusation. It was the forged signature of a city safety coordinator who had retired 6 months ago. Vivian scanned the document twice, then once more to be certain. This wasn't a scare tactic. It was an attempt to simulate official action, and it had reached a level of brazen falsification that removed all doubt about the intent behind it. Vivian didn't call Elliot, She drove directly to the regional government center with the citation in a sealed envelope, walked to the public access desk, and requested confirmation of the citation's authenticity. The clerk, a young woman with a friendly face and overworked eyes, keyed the number into her system. No record, no citation, no infraction, no signature match. Vivian asked for a statement of non-existence and received it, notarized within the hour. She sent a copy to Elliot with the subject line, "They're fabricating law now." The moment she returned home, Vivian activated lockdown protocols. Her house systems entered autonomous perimeter defense mode, an internal protocol designed for hostile field environments. Her access points became read-only. All user overrides were disabled. Any physical contact with sensors would now be logged and mirrored remotely to her legal counsel's cloud server. No more restraint, no more waiting. At 3:08 a.m., the storm came. She had been awake, not from anxiety, but from anticipation. The logs had shown minor spikes in movement near the southwest blind spot, an area partially shielded by overgrown hedges and outside the main camera range. She had kept it that way on purpose, curious to see if they would use it. They did. 2 figures appeared in grainy thermal, neither masked, both hooded, moving with urgency but not chaos. They weren't vandals. They moved like people with an objective. One carried what looked like a slim crowbar. The other had a signal booster. Vivian didn't intervene. Her system did. A non-lethal strobe pulse activated, blinding them with 7,000 lumen bursts from hidden fixtures embedded in the retaining wall. Simultaneously, the inner audio perimeter triggered a high-pitch frequency that would cause physical discomfort within seconds. The figures stumbled, dropped the booster, and fled. But not before one of them turned directly toward the infrared capture unit, giving Vivian a clear, full-frame face. It wasn't Karen. It was the man she'd seen at the mediation. The silent co-complainant who hadn't spoken, only nodded along with Karen's narrative. Vivian extracted the still, ran it through facial analysis, and matched him to an insurance adjuster linked to a company that had formerly contracted with Karen's husband's now-defunct firm. The network wasn't paranoid fantasy anymore. It was real, tangible, and full of people with real stakes in her disappearance. She sent the photo and footage to Elliot under attorney-client protection and asked for an expedited private investigation request. He didn't argue. The documentation was irrefutable. The following morning, Vivian met with an independent auditor who specialized in digital threat escalation linked to property disputes. She presented everything. Every ping, every signature, every spoofed override. By the time the audit concluded, the expert simply said, "You're looking at a coordinated operation. Small scale, but with real sophistication. Whoever's behind it knows how to apply systemic pressure without triggering legal intervention. You're lucky your system is this advanced. Most people wouldn't have caught this until it was too late." Vivian didn't feel lucky. She felt cornered, and worse, she felt bored with the pattern. But this time, the pattern shifted. Karen vanished. No one saw her for 3 days. Her curtains stayed closed. No morning walks. No car movements. Vivian thought briefly that she might be preparing to escalate legally. But on the 4th day, a real city inspector arrived. Not a fake, not anonymous. A senior technician with full ID, a clipboard, and an escort. They politely requested permission to survey the outer installation of her gate. Not the lock, but the base structure, to confirm compliance with updated municipal anchoring regulations. Vivian knew the clause. It had been introduced in a draft session 2 weeks ago, likely pushed by the same people orchestrating her harassment. But it hadn't passed yet. The inspector apologized, said the request had come from a private citizen's petition backed by unusual documentation. Vivian requested to see it. What she received was a scanned affidavit signed by Karen, dated the week prior, and containing a technical schematic of the lock mechanism, one that had never been made public. Vivian excused herself, returned inside, and pulled up her corporate hardware access logs. Someone had accessed the internal design archive for the residential gate model. The credentials used belonged to a support contractor she had fired 6 months earlier for falsifying service hours. Someone later discovered to have been subcontracted by Karen's husband's former firm. She called Elliot. "We're pressing charges." That same day, a cease and desist letter was sent directly to Karen's address, along with a demand for document origin disclosure. But it was returned unopened. Karen had left. Her house was dark. Her mailbox taped shut. No forwarding address. Vivian didn't relax. She increased her private security patrol frequency and instructed her legal team to begin formal proceedings against all known associates involved in the spoofing operation. Then, 2 nights later, she discovered the final message. A plastic bag hanging from her fence. Inside, 3 things. A copy of her company's first patent registration, a child's drawing of a house behind a gate with the words, "Too many locks," and a flash drive. Vivian didn't plug it in. She handed it to her IT chief with strict isolation protocols. The contents, extracted in a secure lab, included a single video file. Low resolution, night vision. It showed Karen standing in front of a whiteboard pointing to a map of the neighborhood. She spoke slowly, clearly, about restoring integrity, reclaiming shared spaces, and preventing algorithmic segregation. It was a manifesto. Vivian watched it once, then deleted it. This wasn't a battle for property. This was a war against autonomy. The neighborhood quieted in the weeks that followed, not with the serenity of peace, but with the tension of retreat. The house across from Vivian's remained dark, curtains drawn, mailbox sealed, its owner gone without a word or a witness. Some residents whispered about foreclosure, others muttered about a breakdown, but no one came forward publicly. The silence surrounding Karen's disappearance was not accidental. It was cultural. This was a place where people mowed their lawns twice a week, where trash bins were aligned with ruler precision, and where discomfort was a private affair, never uttered unless wrapped in casual sarcasm or passive commentary. Vivian understood that silence better than most. It was the sound of collective discomfort failing to find a target. She didn't speak to her neighbors. She didn't wave. She didn't perform any gesture of reconciliation or explanation. She kept her routines, more visible now, but always restrained. Her gate remained closed, its locking mechanism recertified and formally registered under a personal exemption granted by the city council after Elliot's legal campaign revealed the extent of procedural abuse in the prior months. The exemption included an official declaration of full compliance with municipal access law, complete with a digital copy published in the city's public register. No one else in the neighborhood had such a document. The irony didn't escape her. She resumed her work with a precision that bordered on detachment. Her company quietly completed its integration contracts. She declined to pursue civil action against the individuals linked to the spoofing attempts, though all of them received letters through counsel, offering them a choice: submit sworn statements admitting unauthorized interference or face deposition. Most chose the former. No press, no spectacle. Just quiet admissions filed into sealed legal archives. The flash drive, the manifesto, the drawing of the house with too many locks, none of it made its way into the legal case. Vivian made a conscious decision not to let it. There was nothing to be gained by prosecuting the delusions of someone who had already vanished into whatever corner of bitterness she had come from. The message had been clear. Karen hadn't just resented the gate. She resented the autonomy it represented, the refusal to conform, the choice to build without consensus. That kind of resentment wasn't cured with judgment. It was only stilled with time, or silence, or distance. In the end, Vivian didn't install more cameras. She didn't build a higher fence. She didn't change her name or leave the city. She kept everything exactly as it had been, except for one small change. Along the inside wall of her gate, where only she could see it, she etched 3 words into the metal in small, clean print. Still standing here. It wasn't a declaration of victory. It wasn't defiance. It was reminder. The world didn't always welcome those who moved without permission, but that never meant they had to stop.